The last time I was here, I came as a singleton. This time I brought my beloved, who's sitting here in the second row, and I'm going to embarrass her by making her stand up while I introduce her to everybody. There is the mother of my 8 children, and I have to tell you that her maiden name was a real step down for her to marry me, because her maiden name was Vera Cruz, which means true cross. And now she married me and became Vera Mosher. So now she's merely the true Mosher, and I'm her cross. But I guess the best way to introduce her is by telling you a story. We've heard a lot about the coldness that results from God's withdrawal of his blessing from the world, from operating theaters where abortions are done. But let me tell you a story about God's warmth. All of the children have been born by cesarean section, and none of the cesarean sections have been easy. But the 7th cesarean section was so difficult that our wonderful pro-life, pro-family physician, Dr. John Bruchowski in Washington, D.C., who runs the Tepeyac Center in Washington, D.C. Some of you may recognize the name Tepeyac because it was the mountain on which, the hill really above Mexico City, in which the Blessed Mother appeared to St. Juan Diego. So he runs the Tepeyac Center, very pro-life, natural family only physician, OBGYN, a rare breed in the United States, where half the money made by OBGYNs is made from prescribing contraceptives and doing sterilizations. Even very good men are fearful of giving up such a lucrative business. Dr. John did. Well, after the birth of the 7th child, a long and difficult cesarean delivery, he walked in the room to see how my wife was doing, and her first question was, "Can I have another child?" Well, that's not normally what you would hear from someone who had just lost a couple units of blood and had had a long and difficult cesarean section. And he pulled me out of the room. He didn't answer her. He pulled me out of the room and he said, "Well, you better pray long and hard about this." So we did. And the result of those prayers was that my wife came to me and said, let's have another child. Well, we tried. And we've been practicing NFP for very many years, so we knew exactly what to do, but nothing seemed to work. So finally, in 2000, Father Marks and I held a conference in Toronto, in Canada. And we took the whole family up there in our 15-passenger van, had a very intense conference experience. This was a 5-day event. And at the end of it, I said to my wife, let's make a pilgrimage up to Quebec City, because there's a great basilica in Quebec City dedicated to St. Anne, good St. Anne, the grandmother of Jesus, the mother of the Blessed Mother. And I said, let's go and pray to good St. Anne that we'll be blessed with another child. I said, St. Anne will certainly respond to such a prayer, because after all, she too had an infertility problem. She had one child late in life, the Blessed Mother, or so we're told by tradition. So we took the drive up to St. Anne de Beaupré, went into the church, and then started looking for the Blessed Sacrament. And you know, it's not always easy in a church today to find the Blessed Sacrament. It wasn't on the main altar, and so we went down in the crypt church. And it wasn't in the crypt church either. And there was a little side chapel that my wife first discovered, and she went up to the door and tried to open it, and it was locked. And she couldn't get in. And at that point, she turned to me and she said, has anyone come by here wearing perfume? And I said, oh, no, there's no one here. I said, are there any fresh flowers around? And I said, no. Honey, it's April in Quebec. There won't be any flowers for weeks. And so we prayed for a while and we left. And about 30 minutes down the road, my wife had been very quiet for that 30 minutes, unusually quiet. And I turned to her and said, what happened back there? I said, something must have happened. And she said, well, when I went to the door of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel and I found it locked, I was so disappointed, because I wanted to go and pay a visit to my Lord, and there I was on the outside of the door looking in. And I heard a voice say, "I'm here." And then I smelled a wonderful heavenly scent. And I said immediately, "You know what that means?" And that means that our prayer has been answered. And indeed, we went back to Washington. We went to a drugstore, bought one of these little pregnancy tests, and it came back positive. And so the result, 9 months later, was our last child, Kiara Faith Ann Mosher. Kiara, after St. Clair, Santa Kiara. But Faith Ann, because we got her by faith in God through the intercession of good St. Anne. So that's the story of God's warmth that I wanted to tell you. Now, I have a really dreary topic today. My goodness, it's called the death of the West. You all know that Europe is in a demographic winter. I don't need to tell you that. Let me give you, in lieu of that, some good news from the United States. I know that you don't often get good news from the United States. I tune into BBC too. But there actually is good news from time to time. Let me begin by saying we recently hosted a couple of members of the Conservative Party in Washington, D.C. And they had come over to Washington, D.C. basically to ask Republican Party strategists how they did it. How have they become self-identified as the pro-life party in the United States? How have they been able to win 5 of the last 7 presidential elections? How have they been able to capture the House and the Senate? How have they been able to, time after time, to solidify the pro-life vote behind Republican Party candidates? These Conservative Party members said, "We'd like to have the same thing in the UK. We'd like to solidify pro-life sentiment and behind the Conservative Party and become a permanent majority." Well, this is a story that begins about in the late 70s, so almost 30 years ago. We had, up until 1980, we probably had more pro-life sentiment in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. It was, after all, the liberal and moderate wing of the Republican Party which had signed on to Margaret Sanger and Marie Stopes' ideas about racist genetics in the 1920s and 30s, which had supported the idea of government-funded family planning programs to keep down the numbers of the unwashed proletariat. The big supporters of the Family Planning Act of 1972 were George Bush, the first President Bush, who was then a congressman. And in fact, when George Bush was in the Congress for 3 terms as a congressman from the state of Texas, because of his strong advocacy for family planning, his nickname in the Congress was Condom Bush. So how did it come about that the party, the Democratic Party, which had historically stood for the little guy, became pro-abortion? And the Republican Party, which historically had stood for property owners and the owners of businesses and was typified by wealthy Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller, who felt threatened by the poor in their numbers, how did that party become pro-life? Well, in large part, it was due to the actions and the character and the very persuasive rhetoric of one man, one politician, Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan began his career, as a politician at least, as the governor of California. And in 1969, he signed into law the first bill legalizing abortions under some circumstances that was passed by any U.S. state. So how can you say he's pro-life? Well, President Reagan later said that that was the worst mistake he'd ever made in his life. He had been told that this bill would only allow abortion in the case of a danger to the life of the mother, and that 2 physicians would have to sign off before any abortions were allowed to take place. Well, we all know, sadly, 25 years later, from long experience in the pro-life movement, how language like that, presumably narrowly crafted, can be distorted and can be enlarged to be a loophole, as we say, large enough to drive a truck through. And how 2 so-called physicians actually, in practice, metamorphize into 2 abortionists who are in the lucrative and dirty business of killing unborn children. And so that bill became, the writ became the authorization for what quickly became abortion on demand in California. I think that Ronald Reagan carried the guilt of having signed that bill to his grave, to which he went not long ago. I had the privilege of meeting President Reagan on a number of occasions after he left office. I actually wrote a couple of speeches for him. And personally, he was a very kind and decent man. But he was also deeply committed to the pro-life issue. He actually wrote a book while he was in office called Abortion and the Conscience of the Nation. Now, that's not something that a normal politician would do. It's not something that is going to win you a lot of votes. It's certainly not something that's going to get you favorable reviews in the Washington Post, the New York Times, or the other major media. In fact, it's going to earn you criticism and indeed ridicule, as it did. But if you read that book, written by Ronald Reagan, you will see predicted there all of the dangers that he saw and that we're now living that come from legalized abortion. We're seeing the extreme abortion laws in the United States, the so-called mercy killing, the harvesting of organs, euthanasia, weeding out the unfit. All of these horrors are there, predicted by the late President Reagan. Because he was so pro-life and because he was outspokenly pro-life, when you ask him about abortion, he would say, abortion is the taking of a human life. We cannot permit it if we are to remain a civilized people. He would not dance around the issue like most politicians do. That's what politicians do. They dance around issues. They don't answer questions directly. They try to be everything to all men. And of course, they wind up standing for nothing. President Reagan stood for something. And people saw that. And so pro-life Democrats, of which there were millions in the late 70s and early 80s, began to cross over and vote for the Republican Party, not just because of President Reagan, but because the party began to shift as well. It was written into, at President Reagan's insistence, into the Republican Party platform in 1980 that the Republican Party stood for life and wanted to see Roe versus Wade, the infamous decision legalizing abortion in the U.S., overturned. That has stayed in the Republican platform ever since. The Democratic platform, beginning that same year, the Democratic Party became a party of death because it wrote into its party platform, its party constitution, that it was in favor of choice, in favor of continuing legalized abortion. There have been relentless educational efforts over the years in the U.S. by pro-lifers. It often seems that we're not making much progress. The other side holds a demonstration with 5 people, and they're on the evening news. We have 100,000 people march down the Central Avenue, Constitution Avenue of Washington, D.C., and it barely merits a mention on page 17 of the Washington Post. And no picture, of course, because if you published a picture, you'd be able to see how big the numbers are. So our efforts are denigrated, our efforts are ignored by the major media. But pro-life sentiment has spread. There are many strategies for redeeming the culture. But one, of course, is to be fruitful and multiply. You know, we talk about electing pro-family, pro-life representatives to elective office. We talk about, in the U.S., nominating, confirming the right kind of judges. And of course, we evangelize. We try to share a Christian worldview, a pro-life worldview whenever possible, and a pro-life worldview that our non-Christian neighbors can understand. All of these are very important, but there's one thing that has really been changing the electoral landscape in the United States. And that one thing is that pro-lifers in the U.S. are averaging far more children than people who are pro-abortion. The differences are striking. If you go to self-identified pro-life people in the United States, they have 3 children. If you go to self-identified pro-abortion in the United States, they average 1 child. It doesn't take long for that difference, that disparity in the birth rate, to be reflected at the polls as well. We had the privilege this last presidential election to go to the polls with our oldest daughter, Julie, who's now 22. And she voted exactly the way we told her to, which was nice. Our pro-abortion neighbors, husband and wife, no children, went to the polls as always, cast their 2 votes. We cast 3. Next time around, we'll cast 4, then 5, 6, 7. You do the math. Pretty soon we're at 10. Our pro-abortion neighbors are stuck at 2. And when we leave and they leave, there will be 8 pro-life votes and there will be 0 from that camp. Now, that's a very stark illustration of what's happening in more moderate form all across the United States. The pro-life states, the states in the United States that have an above replacement birth rate, vote for the party of life. They vote for pro-life candidates. All the states that have an above replacement birth rate voted for President Bush in the last election. The states that have a birth rate below replacement, where secularism has triumphed, where there is a birth dearth, states like Massachusetts, which are averaging 1.5 children, voted for John Kerry. But what is the future of a state whose couples average 1.5 children? Well, it's a diminishing future. In Texas, they're having 2.5 children. In the South, they're averaging 2.5. So there is a liberal baby bust in the United States. It is not a general baby bust. It is a baby bust limited to liberals, people who have pro-abortion sentiments. And what that means, at least in my country, is a far more morally and family and as far as the life issues are concerned, a far more conservative future for all of us who live there. Because fertility, in the U.S. at least, correlates strongly with a wide range of political and cultural and religious attitudes. If you're welcoming of children, it generally means that you read the good book, because the good book says, be fruitful and multiply. It means that you are generally in church on Sunday. It means that you don't approve of some of Hollywood's more wacko adventures into cultural changes. If, on the other hand, you're a liberal, you don't darken the door of a church, you don't have children, you often don't marry, you may have bizarre sexual habits, and you're probably more likely in some cases to have a dog than to have children. They're actually in Seattle, which is a bastion of leftism now, there are nearly 45% more dogs than children. So an increasing share of the children in the United States are born into families which have conservative values. And those families which have conservative values tend to raise large families. So the result will be a dramatic demographic-driven shift in the United States. So I don't think that pro-lifers in my country have often despaired over the last quarter century, since Roe versus Wade, because it seemed that there was nothing we could do to overturn this terrible decision by 9 Supreme Court justices, 9 black-robed tyrants, who imposed on the entire American people their will, in a 7-2 decision, their will that abortion be legal throughout the entire 9 months of pregnancy. We fought over the years to elect pro-life presidents. That hasn't changed the Constitution of the Supreme Court, although it now is beginning to. We have just over the past year nominated and confirmed 2 pro-life justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. They happen to be practicing Catholics. The one, John Roberts, was recently at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. He's now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And the other, Sam Alito, is said to be a member of Opus Dei. Now, some of you will know what that means. So we now have on the U.S. Supreme Court, out of 9 Supreme Court justices, we have 5 who are Catholic. And 4 of those 5 are good Catholics. And one is, well, we can pray for Supreme Court Justice Kennedy, who is from California and who had a chance in 1992 to overturn Roe versus Wade and decided not to, because basically the Supreme Court argued that would weaken the respect that the American people had for the Supreme Court if they began to reverse their decisions. No, the last defense of the tyrant, do what I say because I tell you to do it. So we have tried over the past few decades to affect the political process, to get our message out in the media, to change the culture, with some success, albeit limited. But it seems that God has given us the solution all along. That God may have sent a cure for AIDS that was aborted, but God has also sent us in the United States a cure for the scourge of abortion, at least that codified in Roe versus Wade. And the cure is not just one child, but all of the children that he's been sending to couples who are pro-life. Because all of those children will grow up, for the most part, opposed to abortion, in favor of eliminating it entirely. And they, in time, will change the culture that they were brought into. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, the Bible tells us. God doesn't work in our time, but in his time. We want action now. We want the law changed overnight. But it's fairly clear now that the law will change in God's time. Not that everything is perfect across the pond. We still have lots of problems. We still have, of course, now, until Roe versus Wade is overturned, we have the most extreme abortion laws in the world. The United States and the People's Republic of China have in common that they both allow abortion throughout the entire 9 months of pregnancy. That's a sad fact. I testify, I've done a lot of work on the People's Republic of China and human rights abuses and other problems we see there. And it hurts me to think that my country and China have that in common, and yet we do. In the United States, of course, we've just seen the terrible death by starvation and dehydration of Terri Schiavo, whom Vera and I and our family prayed for during her entire travail, and her brother is here to tell us more about that tragedy. In the United States, we have now constant battles over whether or not severely disabled or ill patients should have their organs harvested. This sends a chill down my spine as well. We've had people argue that it doesn't harm a patient to take his organs when his heart has stopped but before his brain has. The donor's not feeling anything. If you are about dead, you are probably dead. You are as good as dead, although you might not be exactly dead. But the donors themselves are beyond harm, so we should take their organs. you can see here that slippery ambiguity that they like to use when they're trying to justify something that's unjustifiable. This sends a chill down my spine because this is exactly what they do in China as well. I was just at a hearing before the International Relations Committee testifying on the one-child policy. Sitting next to me on my right was Harry Wu of the Laogai Research Institute. The Laogai is the Chinese labor camp system, like the Chinese Gulag. In Chinese, you say Laogai. In Russian, you say Gulag. But in the Laogai, they are now executing prisoners for their organs. Now, these aren't prisoners who've been sentenced to death, at least not initially. There are prisoners who were sentenced to execution in 2 years. They give you a death sentence and then they suspend it for 2 years, and if you behave yourself in those 2 years, they might change the sentence from death to life imprisonment. Strikes me as cruel and unusual punishment, but that's what they do. They've been executing those people. They've been changing their sentence to immediate execution if they're a tissue match. So donor comes, a prospective client comes in from Hong Kong or Taiwan or Malaysia, Singapore, needs a kidney. They have taken tissue samples of all the prisoners in the prisons. And whoever is a tissue match for that person who needs a kidney gets their sentence changed from life imprisonment to immediate execution, from suspended sentence of death to immediate execution. The ambulances go out to the killing fields, and as soon as the shot is made to the head, they take them to the ambulance and harvest the organs. They apparently haven't been getting them fresh enough in that manner, so they now have mobile hospital vans that actually go to the killing fields. The prisoners are taken inside, manacled, and then given lethal injections. And the organs are taken at that point. Tens of thousands of these operations are done each year. The prisoners have not, by the way, given their consent to donate their organs. The family is not given its consent. They're often not told that organ donation has been done. The bodies are cremated after being executed and the organs are harvested, so the evidence of the taking of the organs is destroyed. That's in China, but in the United States we are fearfully close to that. We do have this ongoing debate as well over stem cells. All of you who have been following the issue know that we're finding more and more uses for adult stem cells. We're finding more and more places where we can harvest adult stem cells from bone marrow and other places. Umbilical cords are another source of stem cells. And so the idea that we should need to create embryos to generate stem cells is nonsensical. And yet that's what we see continuing to happen. Vera and I are from California. The state of California last year just approved a bond issue of $3 billion to do embryonic stem cell research. So the state that we're from is busy funding to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars research efforts which will involve the creation and destruction of probably thousands, tens of thousands, and no reporting requirements, so we won't know the exact number of human beings, so only so they can be dissected and their cells used in research that so far has led nowhere. The number of children in the United States with Down syndrome continues to fall because they're being selectively aborted. California, again, leading the way in this cultural degradation, requires second trimester screening. When we lived in California 10 years ago, that law was already in place, and if you went in to see an OBGYN, he had to do screening for Down syndrome. And if you didn't want the screening done, you actually had to sign a form and assert yourself, because it had become the normal procedure, it was the law, and unless you said, no, I insist that you not do this, they would do the screening. 80% of the couples who find out they're carrying a Down syndrome child then go on to have an abortion. Leon Cass, who until recently was the chairman of the President's Bioethics Council, the President Bush's Bioethics Council in the United States, which is researching and holding hearings on these issues, says that, quote, we in the United States are largely unaware that we have, as a society, already embraced the eugenic principle that defective should not be born. We don't realize it, he said, because our practices are decentralized and because they operate not by coercion, as in China, but by private reproductive choice. In China, of course, they do this by coercion. In China, the law, the one-child policy law, says that we shall have, that couples shall have few children, which in practice means one or sometimes two. They shall practice late childbirth, which means that they shall only give birth several years after getting married, and that they shall have quality children. And quality children, Yousheng, means that they will only have children who are, in the eyes of the state, perfect. And any defective children born in Chinese hospitals today are not allowed to live. There are still children born handicapped in the countryside, outside of the close supervision of the government. Those children are often abandoned. They wind up in orphanages, the lucky ones, and are sometimes adopted overseas. But the United States is not far behind in practicing eugenics. We're just more sophisticated in the way that we go about it than the Chinese, who are relatively crude. Now, just because Ronald Reagan defined the Republican Party as being the party of life doesn't mean that designation couldn't be lost if the next Republican candidate for president is not pro-life or is not strongly pro-life, or if the next Democratic candidate turns out to be someone who can muddle the issue. Nobody who is pro-abortion, who is not pro-abortion, can get the Democratic nomination. The radical feminists, the homosexual movement, the radical environmental movement have captured the party machinery of the Democratic Party. And so no one who is not pro-choice, as they say, who is pro-abortion, can get the Democratic nomination. But what they can do is they can use a rhetoric that will convince millions of Americans that, yes, although they support abortion, they want abortion to be rare. That was President Bill Clinton's genius, the only Democratic president elected in the last 30 years, because he went around saying privately to the radical feminists and to the National Abortion Rights Action League in the United States and to Planned Parenthood, he went around saying, I absolutely support abortion throughout the 9 months of pregnancy. No change in the law. I'm firmly behind Roe versus Wade. But in public, he said he wanted abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. And he ended on the rare. And so people thought, well, he wants to reduce the number of abortions. In fact, the number of abortions increased under his tenure. But he said in public that he wanted to reduce it, and that's the impression that people had. And the nominee in 2008 for the Democratic Party in the United States will probably be Hillary Rodham Clinton. So we're not done with Clintons yet. And Hillary Clinton has been going around saying the same kinds of things that her husband Bill used to say about abortion. She too wants abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. She gave a speech last year in which she claimed to respect, quote unquote, pro-lifers. She said that pro-lifers should join forces with her and people who are pro-choice to reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies. Well, of course, you know how they want to reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies. They want to destroy the innocence of children through pornographic sex education, hand out, condoms like candy, and they argue that will reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies. And of course, it won't. It will increase the number. But she has been using this kind of language recently. And if she continues to use this kind of language, and if the American people aren't paying attention, then she could very well be elected president. And many Americans will vote for her thinking, well, she's not in favor of abortion. She wants abortion to be rare, when in fact she has in practice never seen an abortion she didn't like. We have now, and I will close on this point, we have now at least 4 votes on the Supreme Court for the overturning of the infamous Roe versus Wade decision. which legalized abortion throughout the entire 9 months of pregnancy in the United States. We need one more vote. There has been, in the last week, a rumor that Justice Stevens, who is 85 years old, an age at which it would be perfectly honorable to retire, one would think, is thinking of stepping down. If so, we will have another confirmation battle in the U.S. Senate, similar to the ones we just went through for Justice Roberts. And if President Bush nominates someone in the mold of Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, and Justice Scalia, then we will have another committed Catholic on the Supreme Court. And that would be the fifth vote that would overturn Roe versus Wade. But would that mean the end of abortion in the United States? Sadly, it wouldn't. The only thing that decision would do, that decision overturning Roe versus Wade would do, is it would restore democratic practice on the question of abortion. It would go back to the states individually to regulate abortion. Now, about half the states in the United States forbid abortions. Roughly half of the states of the United States, the states that voted for John Kerry in the last election, allow abortion under certain circumstances. And so that patchwork of laws would then reemerge, and the battle would be fought state by state by state. And states in the South, like the state of Virginia where we live, and states in the West, with the exception of the West Coast, we call it the left coast, in that part of the country, abortion would be illegal under almost all circumstances. In the Northeast and the left coast, abortion would be legal under almost all circumstances. And we would be then fighting a state-by-state battle, and the citizens of each state could decide democratically whether or not they wanted to continue this horrendous practice. Now, the state of South Dakota has already passed a law forbidding all abortions, no exceptions. No exception for rape, incest, life of the mother, those false categories that have been used to confuse so many. This is a law without exception. It was passed because they saw the composition of the Supreme Court changing. Now, there's a big argument in the United States about whether it was prudent at this juncture to pass a law, no exceptions law, forbidding all abortions in South Dakota. Because the National Right to Life Committee says, no, we're one vote short on the Supreme Court. We don't want the South Dakota case to be appealed and go to the Supreme Court now, because the Supreme Court will draw upon the precedent of Roe versus Wade and overturn the South Dakota case, the South Dakota law, and that will create yet one more precedent that will make it harder to overturn Roe versus Wade in the long run. I and many others do not share that view. It takes several years for a case to work its way to the Supreme Court. Right now, the South Dakota law is in place. We assume that Planned Parenthood in the not-too-distant future will challenge that law in federal court. It will take a couple of years for that case to be heard by a federal court justice. Then, whatever the decision is, it will be appealed to the appeals court, the second level of the federal judiciary. That will take a year or two as well, and then it will be appealed to the Supreme Court. So we're talking about a case that will reach the Supreme Court 4 or 5 years down the road. Now, I think, is the time to act. The composition of the Supreme Court is changing. Justice Stevens is 85 years old. He doesn't retire this year. Odds are he'll retire in a year or two. You look at the actuarial tables, 85-year-old men live an average of 12 months. So he probably won't be around in a couple of years. So I think now is the time to move ahead with this legislation. We have waited a long time in the United States for this moment, and there seems no point in waiting further. We do have the votes in the Senate to confirm pro-life Supreme Court justices. We have a president who, whatever his failings, will appoint thoroughly pro-life justices to the Supreme Court. And so now I think is the divinely ordered moment that we end the scourge of abortion, at least in half the United States. So let me end on that point. I've given you some good news today and some not so good news, but that's the world we live in. That's the world we were born into. I'm a Catholic convert. I came in the church in 1991. I thought in my early days as a convert that it would have been nice to have been born in a medieval village where the church bells rang at noon and we all paused in the fields for the Angelus. And of course, that was before I realized that God had sent me here to this time and to this place to do exactly this work. And one can only do His will. Thank you. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
The most important work on the earth today combats the culture of death's sway. For FLI cries in the wilderness the gospel of life to confess. The most important work on the earth today combats the culture of death's way. For FLI cries in the wilderness the gospel of life to confess. We pray. Never veering on the false and myths that clearly confuse the mind, where the culture turns and twists. We're thrilled by trinkets that we find through politics, the heart and soul of our great history is sold for fame and power and control, and we are given the useless gold. The most important work on the earth today combats the culture of death's way. For FLI cries in the wilderness the gospel of life to confess. The most important work on the earth today combats the culture of death's way. For FLI cries in the wilderness the gospel of life to confess. We pray. A solemn call fills the air, and with urgency was brought a word for all, far and near. Truths to love with passion taught. Truth can always be ignored. Now the culture can combats the culture of this way. For FLI cries in the wilderness, the gospel of life to